Well, first, you have to define what international crimes means. And typically, we're talking about the core international crimes, of which there are 4: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. So when you're talking about disrupting international crimes, we're really talking about disrupting the commission of international crimes. And that's because all of these types of core international crimes, they shock you to the core. They are called atrocity crimes because they are atrocious, but they require a certain level of supply chain management to get to that point of committing atrocities. And that supply chain crosses all borders and is of all kinds of natures and efforts required to combat them. So the types of tools range from, first, international cooperation to targeting the financial underpinnings of any kind of criminal network. It also can range from diplomatic pressure, such as sanctions and other tools of that sort, export control violations. Then you also, putting aside the criminal aspect, you have civil, regulatory, and administrative tools that you can use for enforcement actions. And then lastly, of course, in the commission of international crimes, a lot of reliance is spent on using and strengthening national tools like existing legislation, but also improving legislative frameworks and enhancing them to make them more effective. International cooperation is hands down the most important tool, and it is the nuts and bolts for all of the other tools for a successful investigation and prosecution. The reason being, the cross-border nature of crime requires us to use cross-border efforts in order to effectuate accountability throughout. The practical challenges in trying to utilize and effectuate international cooperation are just like in any kind of collaborative environment. You have different actors, different stakeholders, some of which have interests that align and some that do not and are competing. And it's making sure that everyone is working together in one united mission, one team, one fight, in order to advance accountability. Some of the traditional tools to target financial underpinnings of criminal networks include your bread and butter following the money. So that's financial investigations and prosecutions, such as subpoenaing bank records, analyzing financial transactions, and the such. They also include traditional measures like asset forfeiture, recovery, and confiscation in order to obtain the ill-gotten gains of criminals and take them away from them and use the liquidation of those assets or the proceeds of those assets to restitute victims. Some of the more creative tools that are coming out now in this age of social media, of course, include OSINT, which stands for Open Source Intelligence. This is publicly available information on the internet. In addition to OSINT, there are tools like WebInt tools, which is web intelligence. And what that is taking unstructured data from the various open source sources that is publicly available and putting it in a structured manner to better tailor and analyze that open source data. Some other creative methods of targeting financial underpinnings of networks include applying tactics that you would normally use in other types of cases, not white-collar cases. So for example, in organized crime cases and violent crime cases, we use confidential sources regularly, special investigative techniques, of course, OSINT and WebInt, but making sure that you're using all of the tools that are available to investigators and prosecutors, not just for one specific type of crime, but for other types of crimes as well. When we talk about sanctions, it depends on the types of sanctions that are being issued. And so first off, there's two kind of categories of sanctions. The first are comprehensive sanctions and targeted sanctions. And a big part of sanctions is understanding how to manage expectations and also figure out exactly what the objective is. What a sanction is trying to change or influence a person, entity, or country's behavior. So with that objective in mind, then you have to figure out exactly the type of sanction to impose to change or influence that behavior. Of course, there are many criticisms related to sanctions of whether they're actually effective. In my personal opinion, I do believe they can be effective if they're applied comprehensively. So that means not only targeting individual sanctions against individuals where we want to change or punish or influence their specific individual behavior, but also in tandem with utilizing sanctions against entities that may be helping to effectuate that individual's behavior that we're trying to change, or that country's general behavior. And there are a variety of ways to do this. A big part of enhancing national legislation or gaps is first identifying after a clear assessment of what gaps exist and how to fix them. So for example, in the United States, we recently amended our war crime statute, which had been in effect for over 30 years, but had never been utilized until recently. A major reason why it wasn't utilized is because it had a 5-year statute of limitations and a jurisdictional restriction that required the defendant or the victim to be a United States national. With these ongoing conflicts that are coming up all over the world, we wanted to expand the jurisdiction of the statute to be able to reach victims and perpetrators more broadly, as well as in terms of time, extending the time that was required that we could bring the statute to bear. And so part of that was in our own experiences, understanding the limitations of what the statute had and how we were able to fix it. And that's how we identified those two particular gaps. In 2023, U.S. Congress amended the war crime statute such that there is no longer a statute of limitations, and there's no longer the requirement that a defendant or the victim has to be a U.S. national. The only jurisdictional nexus or requirement that remains now is that the defendant or the victim have to eventually be found at some point in the United States. That broadly expands the legislation such that, 30, 40, 50 years from now, we will be able to prosecute criminals for war crimes as opposed to what we were doing before, which was heavily on citizenship, naturalization, passport control fraud. Another kind of simple way for states to enhance their legislation or legislative gaps is simply by identifying, when it comes to core international crimes and disrupting them, the amount of staff or specialized knowledge that they have. And so assessing the needs from each country and having dedicated staff and personnel to build that expertise is another way to fill that gap. That all contributes to complementarity, which in essence is making sure that efforts are not duplicated and that everyone is working towards one goal. This ensures that states are doing as much as they possibly can be doing, and then on an international level, international institutions are also doing what they're supposed to and can be doing.